you, John. And thanks for coming to listening to me. In the time that I have available to me today, I'm going to talk about a few different things. I'm going to talk about general principles underlying grant funding. I'm going to talk quite a bit about the business case because that underlines all funding. I'm going to talk a little bit about funding agencies, and then I'm going to talk about do's and don'ts. And if time permits, in the end, if Jacob doesn't tell me to shut up, I'll tell you what I have found to be the golden rule of grant funding over the last 16 or 17 years that I've been involved in this game. In the past, most grants, you could get grants for R&D, you could get grants for export. These days, realistically, you can only get grants for innovation. Export is innovation, and pretty much anything, any job that you need to do can be in some way worded under the innovation. Governments are all the time looking for innovation. Innovation is not about blue sky research. It is about, realistically, any incremental improvement in the profitability or the capability of the business. Now, I'm moving on to talk about general principles of funding. I'm speaking from the point of view of a guy that companies hire to go in and pay them to get grant applications. Then sometimes they pay me to draw down the claims as well. So most of the stuff we're going to talk about is stuff that I've come across with companies and with funders. Before you get involved in any funding operation, you need to know precisely what you want to do with that funding. From the point of view of the project itself, what you want to do and how you propose to do it. In other words, approach it from the wish list point of view. These days, that plan or that work plan has to be export driven, either in actual or in aspirational form. Okay? It has to talk about job creation. Enterprise Ireland in its application, in its funding mechanism, talks about giving a grant equivalent to 15,000 per job generated by the project. And with any grant, paperwork is involved. If you're not prepared to sit down and do an application form, and by that I mean some sort of a business case, present some sort of accounts, and finally, the most difficult job for most funders, drawing down claims. You will need to be involved in paperwork. Okay? If you're not in a position to do that, you can forget about that. The fundamental thing to remember is that all funders want to give out the funds. Despite what they say, that's their job, and they're very keen to get it out. We'll even go so far as to tell you what they want. It's just a question of us then giving them what they want and giving them drafts before we submit it. All of funds these days revolve in some way around a business plan or a business case. That doesn't necessarily have to be a big plan over 50 or 60 pages for the business, but it does have to be a simple business case for the project that you're talking about getting funding for. And that needs to look at a 3-year term. What's the target market? What's the scale of the project? How are you going to do the project in terms of milestones? What's that project going to give you in terms of USPs? Do you have a walkaway plan for the project? And finally, do you realistically think you can do that within the confines of the current business and your current family situation? The aim of that business plan or business case is to clarify the objectives, identify any barriers. Now, if you tell me you have no competition and there are no barriers and no risks in this project, no funder will believe that. There are always competitors. There are always risks. What they're looking for when they ask for risk mitigation is how do you intend to manage the risks and reduce those risks. You will have to be able to demonstrate a business case in terms of the return on the work for the project, and you'll have to do that in some form of a critical path or a work plan. These days, grants. In the past, grants tended to cover a lot of capital equipment. That doesn't happen anymore. Grants these days cover salaries. In order to claim down salaries, you need to be in a position to do timesheets. Most funders will give you templates for timesheets. If you're not in a position to generate timesheets from staff, diaries that are working on the project, they're not really going to fund you, and they're certainly not going to validate your claims. Admin, overheads, consumables, materials. Strangely enough, laptops and computer equipment these days is viewed as a consumable. Project management costs, technical consultancy such as colleges, universities, subcontracting costs, and travel. Very difficult to get capital equipment funded with most of the funding agencies these days. And even if they do fund capital equipment, they tend not to fund it for more than about 10-15% of the project. I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time looking at the different funding agencies for the simple reason that there are so many funding agencies out there. I bore you all to tears and put you all to sleep in about 10 minutes. But they can boil down into 2 or 3 funders. Local enterprise offices tend to work with startups and businesses that are up to 10 employees and up to €1 million euros in sales. Enterprise Ireland tends then to work with companies that have to be export oriented, have to have more than 10 employees, or in excess of €1 million in sales. The exception to that is very high potential startup units. Intertrade Ireland is a cross-border funding agency, which is a very useful funding agency to allow you to get started in the game of project management and funding. They have a stand downstairs, and Alison Quinn, one of my predecessors here today, spoke about some of the projects they're involved in. In all Intertrade Ireland funding, there tends to be a cross-border dimension of some kind. In addition to innovation or R&D type funds, there are what are called company development grants, particularly in terms of HDSU and growth funds with Enterprise Ireland, and with a whole range of sales development type grants with Intertrade Ireland. The emphasis in what I'm talking about tends to be innovation rather than company growth. The reason for that is quite simple. Most projects can be done under innovation. Most funding agencies that look at company growth funds tend to be more concerned with job creation, and there needs to be a 3-year retention of those jobs. So if you're unsure as to whether a project is going to lead to success, it's probably better to put it under an R&D fund rather than a growth fund, because if you're not in a position to retain the jobs that you create, there will be a clawback on the grant when they are 3 years down. Selected programs, again, I'm going to spend very little time talking about these. Enterprise Ireland innovation vouchers, feasibility studies, commercialisation funds. But they're all basically the same thing, based around the general principles that I spoke about earlier. Enterprise Ireland has innovation partnerships, working to develop partnerships between colleges and companies, R&D funds, large grants. Enterprise Ireland gets grants from 5,000 up to 650,000 for various R&D type projects. We'll speak a very small amount about some of the non-grant funding agencies. The Halo Business Angel Network provides access to funds from 25 to 250,000. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that because John Phelan is coming on after me and he's going to do a whole presentation on Halo Business Angels. Microfinance Ireland is administered by the County Enterprise Boards, and that gives you access to funds from 2,000 to 25,000. EIIS, the Employment Investment Incentive Scheme, that's the old EBS, that again allows for funding from private investors to come into your business. And the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund is for very, very large projects managed by NTMA. If anybody wants to talk about those, get in touch with me. I'll be around for most of the day. We're going to start talking about the do's and don'ts now. Generally speaking, with any application, you're going to need 2 years statutory financial statements. if you're reluctant to provide those, you can forget about getting a grant. If you need any funding authority to sign an NDA or something like that, by all means ask the host, and we'll be very happy to do that. If those figures are more than 9 months old, they will generally ask you for a set of management accounts as well. And obviously you will need some form of set of projections. Funding do's and don'ts. We start with the do's. Always define the project in simple terms. What is the business case? What is the cost of the project? Ask the funder what they want and give them what they want. Give drafts of the application form to the funders. And most of this can be done without hiring guys like me to do it. Work with the funding agencies. Give yourself plenty of time. Ask them what they want. Give them a draft. Is this what you want? And then do what they say after that. Because most of them are mad to get out funds. Prepare early and involve all the relevant company personnel. And I'll talk a bit about that later on. Be ready to make the claims. At minimum, if you're working with EI, be in a position to do timesheets. Tends to be the most difficult one. If you don't know what a timesheet is, ask them. But it's very useful if you record the time in their diaries of all the staff that are involved in a particular project. That way, at least you'll have basic records and it'll be easy enough to generate timesheets when it comes to payment. Be ready to do paperwork. Now the funding don'ts. Never hire a consultant. God forgive me for saying this, I am a consultant. Never hire a consultant without a clear project definition and a business case in your head at least. So if somebody came in to me and asked, can you get me a grant? I'd say, what do you want to do? How do you expect to make money? If you can't answer those questions, I really will be wasting your time. Even if the consultant has done dozens of applications before, never leave them to do it completely on their own, because it'll look like they've done it completely on their own. If you have one person who's charged with writing up this project in your own company, for God's sake, make sure they liaise with somebody in the company, particularly the sales guys and the accountancy guys and the textile guys. Because what happens a lot of the time is somebody new comes in, they're asked to fill out a grant application. They try and talk to the sales guys won't have time, the accountants won't have time because they're doing projections, VAT returns, management accounts, whatever accountants do, and the managing director who never has time at all. It will look as if somebody has written this project without any detail on the company. So always involve plenty of people from within the company in trying to spec out the project and help whoever's writing that grant up. Never rush an application. Never use grants to do work that you never would have done without the grant. Always use the grant to reduce the cost of something that you were going to do anyway. In that case, you have the idea for the project already in your head. And never try to fool an assessor. It's their job to catch out lies. The assessors will look for the following things. Is there a work plan, and does the project challenge the company? Does the project fit within the company's strategic plan? And what are the barriers to overcome? Does the company clearly lack the ability to do that project? Has the company demonstrated they could not just bring in a consultant or buy an off-the-shelf solution for the project? What is the key technology to be researched, and will it increase employment? Will it increase exports? Is there a good business case? In other words, what's the payback? Are the objectives clear and reflective of the work plan and target outcomes? Are there clear benefits to the company? And can the company afford to run this project, bearing in mind that no grants are paid up front? All grants tend to be paid in retrospect, so there is a cash flow implication. Is the company financially stable? And is the project innovative? I think Jacob is waving at me to stay quiet. So this is my golden rule of innovation. It always costs twice as much, it always takes twice as long, and it always delivers half of what you expect. Because invariably the project is dreamed up by the managing director, and he is invariably a sales guy, and he invariably sees the most positive outcome. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be around for this.
Thank you very